In the summer of 1904, the mountains were considered dependable. They were not gentle nor forgiving, but they were understood. Stone, weather, elevation, these were known quantities to the men who made their living guiding others through high passes and narrow valleys. Fog, too, was familiar. It arrived with patterns, moved with wind, lifted when the sun allowed it. No one, at the start of that season, recorded any fear of it. The incident would later be traced to a remote alpine corridor in Central Europe, a region marked on survey maps but rarely described in detail. Contemporary records place it along a secondary trade and shepherd route used intermittently since the mid-1800s. The elevation varied sharply. Forested lower slopes gave way to exposed stone shelves, with glacial runoff feeding narrow ravines below. The guides were not inexperienced men. 3 names appear repeatedly in local records and correspondence: Johann Lurch, age 56, Emil Kover, 32, and Matthias Brenner, 51. All had guided travelers, merchants, and researchers through these mountains for years. Lurch had been born in a nearby village and knew the seasonal behavior of the weather intimately. Brenner had worked with survey teams during the border remapping of the 1890s. Kover, the youngest, kept a small leather-bound journal, portions of which survive only in quotation through later accounts. In early July, the men were contracted to escort a pair of geological observers to a series of ridgelines where mineral deposits had been reported. The work was routine. The pace was unhurried. They expected to be in the high valley for less than a week. Initial entries described nothing unusual. Mornings were cold but clear. Evenings brought predictable cloud cover. Smoke from their campfire rose straight upward, suggesting calm air. One note mentions distant bells from grazing animals further downslope. Another records the sound of ice shifting along the stream at night. It is worth noting what is absent from these early accounts. There is no mention of fear, no superstition, no warnings from locals. The valley was described as empty but workable, a phrase that appears in both Brenner's notes and a later newspaper paraphrase. The first subtle irregularity appears almost accidentally, embedded in an otherwise ordinary description. Kover writes of a fog bank entering the lower valley earlier than expected, before sunset, despite stable weather. He remarks that it did not drift in strips, but as one body. The note is brief and carries no emphasis. The following morning, the fog had not fully lifted. This, too, was not alarming. Mountain fog can linger in shadowed basins long after dawn, but Lurch reportedly commented on its boundary, how sharply it held to the valley floor, refusing to thin even as sunlight reached the upper slopes. They continued their work. Measurements were taken, samples packed, paths followed that had been walked dozens of times before. Still, the fog remained below them, pooled between the trees like standing water. At one point, Brenner noted that its edge appeared closer than it should have been, as though the basin had grown shallower overnight. No one suggested leaving. There are moments, in hindsight, that later witnesses would mark as the beginning. But at the time, nothing had yet occurred that demanded explanation. The fog was present, that was all. And in 1904, fog did not follow men. On the 9th morning, the party set out just after dawn. The fog hadn't changed. It was thick, absorbing sound, making voices feel dull and distant. The lead guide, unalarmed, simply chose a slower pace. The first strange thing happened midway up the ascent. A guide at the rear lost sight of the man just 30 paces ahead. He called out. The reply sounded much farther away than it should have. They corrected the spacing and dismissed it. Shortly after, the surveyor noticed something else. The fog seemed denser behind them, as if the path was closing behind the group. He blamed it on a trick of the light, but the stops became more frequent, the unease growing with each strange event. The fog wasn't just weather anymore. It was something else, something that held its shape, pressing in on them. As they walked, a pattern emerged. Stop, and the fog would thicken. Move, and it would thin just enough to let them pass. The 10th day began without change. The fog remained in place through the early hours, neither lifting nor thickening. It showed no reaction to sunrise, and the temperature rose slightly without altering its density. This alone was unusual enough to be remarked upon, though still not alarming. The guides conferred quietly before breaking camp. They chose a route that would keep them on higher ground, avoiding the valleys where fog was known to collect and linger. It was a practical decision, rooted in experience. Several of the men had taken similar paths dozens of times under worse conditions. Progress was slower than planned. Within the first hour, one of the surveyors recorded that the rear of the group appeared less distinct than the front, even though the spacing had not changed. When the line was compressed to maintain visual contact, the same effect persisted. The fog seemed to compress with them. Again, no one spoke of this as a problem. By late morning, the guides began to notice that landmarks were appearing later than expected. A rock formation that should have emerged after a short ascent remained unseen until they were nearly upon it. When it did appear, it emerged suddenly, without gradual definition. One guide remarked that the mountain felt shortened, as though distance itself had been reduced. This was met with quiet disagreement. Fatigue was blamed, so was poor light. At midday, the party stopped near a ridge break to rest and take bearings. The fog ahead thinned slightly, allowing a faint outline of the next slope to be seen. Behind them, however, visibility had decreased further. One of the men turned fully around and noted that he could no longer see the point where they had stopped earlier that morning. This, too, was written down. What troubled them was not the loss of visibility, but its consistency. The fog behind them appeared heavier than the fog ahead, regardless of wind direction or terrain. When the wind shifted briefly from the west, the fog did not respond. The guides tested this. They sent 2 men a short distance downhill to check conditions. Those remaining above watched them descend until their figures faded. Moments later, the men returned, reporting that the fog below was no thicker than above. Yet when the group resumed movement, the fog behind once again appeared denser. No explanation satisfied everyone. In the afternoon, the first sign of unease appeared in the journals, not fear, but irritation. One surveyor wrote of conditions that resist measurement. Another noted repeated compass checks, all of which returned consistent readings despite their growing sense of disorientation. The guides began marking their progress more deliberately. They broke small branches, scraped stone, and noted irregularities in the ground. These were standard practices when visibility was poor. Yet one guide later stated that when he glanced back, he could not always see the markers he had just made. This was the first detail that caused quiet concern. By early evening, camp was made earlier than scheduled. The men spoke little as they worked. Fires were built close together, not for warmth, but for visibility. The fog did not retreat from the firelight as expected. It stopped just beyond it, holding its line. That night, several men reported the same impression. The fog seemed closer when they were still, and less present when they moved. One man wrote that it felt as though the camp existed within a pocket, separate from the surrounding slope. Another wrote that he avoided walking beyond the firelight, not out of fear, but because he could not judge how far the ground extended. No one claimed to see movement. No shapes were described, but sleep was brief and broken. Men woke thinking they heard footsteps, only to find the ground undisturbed. Watches were changed more frequently, though nothing was recorded as having occurred. In the final entry of that night, a guide wrote a single sentence, placed carefully at the bottom of the page. It behaves as though it is aware of our position. He did not expand upon this. The following morning, they would attempt to leave the ridge, and by then, the fog would no longer be treated as a passive condition of the mountain. Dawn never truly broke on the 11th day. The light just seeped through the thick, unchanging fog. The guides decided to descend. Staying high on the ridge was useless without visibility, and the lower route, while longer, had landmarks they knew. Or, so they thought. The descent felt wrong almost immediately. The slope was steeper than they remembered, and distances were distorted. Men stumbled on ground that should have been familiar. Then the fog ahead thickened as they moved, while thinning behind them. When they stopped, the opposite happened. This was unnatural. A surveyor stepped away for a moment and vanished. He reappeared minutes later from a completely different direction, shaken, saying he'd only walked a few steps but became lost instantly. They tried to climb back up, but the mountain had changed. Rock formations were gone, trees were displaced. Panic wasn't the word, but a deep strain set in. They no longer trusted their compasses, their memories, or the ground itself. The fog was a presence, and it was closing in. The 12th day began in silence. There is no description of dawn, only a note that light returned without clarity. The fog remained unchanged, holding the same narrow perimeter around the camp. It did not thin with movement, nor did it press closer when the men remained still. Instead, it held steady, as though the limits had already been decided. The guides gathered the party and spoke plainly. And the fog no longer behaved in relation to wind, slope, or time of day. A decision was made to conserve energy and attempt a controlled movement toward what they believed to be the nearest known descent marked on their maps and supported by compass bearing alone. No one argued. They built a small cairn from loose stone and cut into the bark of a nearby tree. These were deliberate acts, recorded carefully. The men then advanced for what they believed was a considerable distance before halting again. When one guide suggested turning back to check the marker, the group agreed. They did not find it. The fog where the marker should have been appeared no different from the surrounding ground. No cairn, no cut tree. The compass reading was unchanged. This marked a shift in behavior. Voices were raised for the first time, not in panic, but in protest. Accusations were not directed at one another, but at the conditions themselves. One journal page contains only a list of names, written once, then rewritten, as though the writer were confirming who was still present. The fog now pressed to within a few paces, blurring even nearby faces. Food was eaten without conversation. Several men failed to finish their portions. One guide recorded nausea, another a persistent headache. These symptoms were attributed to altitude and strain, though the elevation should have been decreasing. That evening, for the first time, the men spoke of returning by the way they had come. This was dismissed almost immediately. The way they had come no longer existed in any reliable sense. There was no shared agreement on what lay behind them, only that it was obscured more completely than what lay ahead. Before sleep, the senior guide instructed each man to write what he could remember of the route taken since entering the fog. These accounts differ significantly. Distances, directions, and landmarks do not align. Even the sequence of events varies. No one commented on this at the time. We are attempting to record this so that we may later understand it. At present, recording does not help. There is no further elaboration. The fog remained throughout the night. And when the party attempted to move again, they would find that time itself, like distance and direction, had become unreliable. The men descended without further incident. Their accounts aligned in broad outline, but diverged in detail. Each described fog that behaved incorrectly. Each insisted that orientation had become unreliable. They chose their words carefully.